In the autumn of 1878, a farmer was plowing a dry creek bed in western Arkansas when the point of his blade struck something solid. He assumed it was a root. It turned out to be a rifle, a Sharps carbine military issue. Its stock was blackened from an old fire, its barrel warped by heat, and it was wrapped in the decaying remnants of a cotton sack. Along the inner seam of that sack, stitched in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of those names had already been recorded on federal death warrants filed at the courthouse in Fort Smith, just across the state line. The other 2 had disappeared from every census, every tax roll, and every church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the ground had simply opened and closed over them without a word. That same afternoon, as the farmer carried the rifle and the sack into town and placed both on the desk of the federal marshal. Within 48 hours, the rifle was missing. The farmer's written statement had vanished, and the name at the very bottom of the cotton sack, underlined 3 times in that same rust-colored thread, had disappeared along with them. For nearly a century, no serious historian would acknowledge that the name belonged to a woman, and when the truth finally emerged, hidden in the private letters of a court clerk, opened by a descendant in 1962, it contained a detail so unsettling that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, chose not to publish it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we go on with the story of the woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nanyehi, meaning Sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier whose name made outlaws bury their weapons in the dirt and flee toward the Mexican border, do me a small favor. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of these forgotten stories. And in the comments, tell me what state, country, or city you're listening from right now. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel, and I read every single comment. To understand what this woman did, and why the records of it are so deliberately broken, you first have to understand the country she did it in. The land between the Arkansas River and the Red River in the years after the Civil War was not a state. It was not, in any meaningful legal sense, America. It was the Indian Territory, a vast expanse of unorganized country stretching across what is now the eastern half of Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced removals of the 1830s. Because it was not a state, state law did not apply there. Because the tribal courts held jurisdiction only over their own citizens. Any man or woman who was not a tribal member, and not a federal soldier, could commit murder in broad daylight on a creek road at noon and walk away untouched by any sheriff. Every outlaw, deserter, horse thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and runaway killer east of the Rocky Mountains knew this. They had known it since the end of the war. By 1870, the territory had become the largest sanctuary for fugitives on the North American continent, a region of roughly 70,000 square miles with a white criminal population estimated by the Federal Marshals Office at more than 20,000 men. The only law that followed these men in was the United States Marshal Service. Riding out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a hanging judge named Isaac Parker. Over the course of his 21-year career on the bench, Parker would sign the execution warrants of 79 men and preside over the trials of more than 13,000 cases. To enforce Parker's warrants across the territory, the marshals relied on a peculiar class of contracted riders called deputy marshals, about 200 of them at any given time, and beneath them a rougher class still, the freelance bounty hunters, who were paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail and per corpse delivered with verifiable identification for the warrant attached. The pay was $2 for an arrest, plus 10 cents a mile, plus a share of whatever reward the fugitive's specific warrant happened to carry. Most bounty hunters in the territory were ex-Confederate cavalrymen down on their luck, Chickasaw freedmen who knew the back country, Cherokee veterans of the Union Indian Home Guard still young enough to ride hard, or former outlaws who had cut deals with Parker's court to hunt their old partners for money. The average bounty hunter in that period lasted about 4 seasons before he was killed or crippled. Almost none of them survived a full decade, and almost every single one of them was a man. The woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nanny did not fit a single one of those categories. She had been born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around the year 1840. She had escaped in the autumn of 1864 while Sherman's army was cutting through Georgia 600 miles to the east. She had crossed the Mississippi River on a stolen flatboat the winter of her freedom, and by the spring of 1869 she was living alone in a one-room cabin on the border between the Choctaw Nation and the state of Arkansas, keeping a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington Army revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck with 7 small bone beads strung on it. How she got from a cotton field in Yazoo County to that cabin on that border, and what she did once she arrived, is the question this story attempts to answer. It is not a pleasant question, and the answer, as far as the records we still have allow us to reconstruct it, is not a pleasant answer. Her name on the Carrick plantation ledger was Hester. No surname was recorded, because none of the Carrick people were given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation itself lay along a stretch of Yazoo River bottomland about a day's ride northwest of the city of Vicksburg, and was owned by a family named Carrick, whose patriarch, Thomas Carrick, had by the census year of 1860 brought the number of human beings he held in bondage to 163. Hester was 13 years old when she first appeared in the Carrick inventories as a field hand, priced at $400. She was 24 years old when those inventories stopped being kept in the summer of 1864. They stopped being kept because by that summer, Thomas Carrick himself had fled south to Alabama with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind him an overseer named Abner Gossett with full effective command of the property and the 156 human beings still on it. Abner Gossett was the kind of man whose reputation does not survive in the polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive vividly, and in terrible detail, in the Works Progress Administration slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. 3 different former Carrick people, interviewed independently in 3 different states over the course of 2 years, described Abner Gossett in nearly identical terms. He was a small man, no more than 5 feet 6 inches tall, with pale red hair thinning on top, pale red eyelashes, skin that burned easily in the sun, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, almost patient smile, when he gave the orders that would cause suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs trained from puppies to catch runaways, and he had taught the lead dog to hold a grown man at the throat without closing its jaws. He kept a leather-handled braided whip, which he had named, without any apparent sense of blasphemy, the preacher, and which he used with what one of the interviewed women called a terrible patient steadiness, as if he were reading a sermon out loud 1 verse at a time. And he kept a ledger of his own, separate from the plantation books, in which he recorded the punishments he had administered, and the names of the people who had been, in his own particular phrase, mission corrected. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other name. We know this not from the ledger itself, which was burned sometime in 1865, but from the testimony of a woman named Rhoda Green, who had been Hester's half-sister by their shared mother. In the spring of 1937, at the age of 91, Rhoda sat on the back porch of her granddaughter's house in Memphis, Tennessee, and talked for 4 hours into the microphone of a WPA interviewer named Lemuel Cross. The interviewer's typed transcript, now held in the collection of the Library of Congress, runs to 47 pages. 41 of those pages are about Abner Gossett. The other 6 are about what Hester did on the night she left. It was the 2nd week of September in the year 1864. The cotton was in. The war was 16 months from its end, although no one on the Yazoo River knew that yet. That afternoon, the Gossett had ordered 3 men flogged publicly in the yard for the theft of corn from the corn crib. By nightfall, the 3 men had been locked inside the crib itself, a stone-walled, windowless building with a single heavy door, with no water and no treatment of any kind for the wounds on their backs. One of the 3 men was Hester's younger brother, a young man of about 19 years whose given name in the plantation ledger is recorded only as Cass. According to Rhoda Green, the moon that night was near full, but heavy cloud cover was moving in from the southwest. Hester waited without speaking, without eating her supper, without lying down on her pallet, until the cloud bank finally crossed the face of the moon a little before 200 in the morning. Then she stood up. She took off her shoes because they made a sound on the boards. She walked barefoot, carrying nothing in her hands, across the plantation yard and through the kitchen garden and up to the slab door of the main house, where Abner Gossett slept alone in a ground-floor bedroom, because his wife had left him 3 years earlier and gone back to her mother's people in Tennessee. She did not speak. She did not scream. She did not, according to Rhoda Green, even breathe hard. What she did to Abner Gossett in the next several minutes, and with what instrument, the WPA interviewer Lemuel Cross declined to transcribe in full. The transcript at that exact point contains only a single notation in Cross's handwriting. Subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes. Then a single resumed sentence in Rhoda Green's own voice. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back across the yard to the corn crib. Broke the iron hasp of the lock with the long iron bar that Gossett himself had used earlier that day to bar the door. Carried her brother out on her back, because he could no longer walk or stand, and laid him down gently under a pecan tree on the edge of the yard, where a woman named Delphia was already waiting in the dark with a stoneware jug of sweet water and a poultice of chewed tobacco leaves and lard for the wounds on his back. Hester did not stay. She did not even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gossette's revolver. She took Gossette's boots. She took Gossette's thoroughbred horse from the stable. And she rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the following night, she had reached the Union Army picket line outside the city of Vicksburg, where a young corporal in the 47th Illinois Volunteer Infantry would later write in a letter to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse had come walking out of the cane at dusk, with a pistol stuck in her belt and the calmest face he had ever seen in his life. The woman, the corporal wrote, had said her name was Hester, that she was 24 years old, that she was not going back, and that she would not say goodbye to her brother because she was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to leave. The corporal's letter, preserved today in the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield, is the first document anywhere in the United States of America in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last document anywhere in which she appears under that name. From the Vicksburg picket line, she moved north with the Union supply trains, working her passage in exchange for food and a place to sleep. By the winter of 1865, she had reached the river depot town of Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. There she found work as a laundress in a boarding house that catered to Union officers, and there, according to two separate references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps, held today at the National Archives in Washington. She also served unpaid as a tracker and a scout attached to a Union cavalry detachment under the command of a captain named Winthrop Haight. Captain Haight was a Vermonter, a graduate of Dartmouth College, a man who kept a daily diary from the outbreak of the war to the day of his death in 1888. His diaries were recovered in 1951 from his family estate outside Brattleboro and donated to the University of Vermont. 3 of those diary entries, and only 3, mention Hester. In the first entry, dated the 11th of February 1865, Captain Haight writes that the colored woman H. brought in 2 deserters from the 27th Missouri before sundown, without assistance, without firing her weapon, and asked for no payment of any kind, only a pair of Army-issue boots in her own size, which he provided from the quartermaster.